The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the quiet streets. A cool breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the fallen leaves on the sidewalk. Among the evening's quiet hum of life, a woman walked alone, her eyes lost in the distance. Her shoulders were hunched, her steps slow, as if the weight of the world pressed down on her. Her name was Sarah, a single mother who had once carried the world in her arms. The world being her son, Michael. He had been everything to her. The reason she smiled, the reason she fought through every hardship, and the reason she had believed in tomorrow. But now, tomorrow was just an empty, endless stretch of days without him. Every night, she cried herself to sleep. Every morning, she woke up to the same aching emptiness. It had been months, yet the pain had not lessened. If anything, it had grown heavier. She had stopped counting the days since she had last heard his laughter, since she had last held his hand. The world kept moving, but for her, time stood still. That evening, as she walked through the quiet streets, she barely noticed the people around her. She barely heard the distant sound of traffic, or the faint melody of a street musician playing his guitar on the corner. The world blurred, and her mind was filled with only one thought: Michael. Where was he now? Was he safe? Was he happy? Did he think of her the way she thought of him every second of every day? The questions tormented her, but no answer ever came. She passed by a small cafe, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. Inside, people sat at tables, laughing, talking, living their lives. Sarah paused for a moment, staring through the window. She used to take Michael to places like this. He loved chocolate milkshakes, always insisting they add extra whipped cream. She could almost hear his little voice in her head, see the way his eyes lit up when he took the first sip. But the image faded, leaving only emptiness behind. She turned away and kept walking. The further she walked, the heavier her heart felt. The city around her was alive, but she felt like a ghost drifting through it, unseen and unheard. And then she heard it, a sound so faint, so distant, yet so familiar, that her entire body froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart pounded against her ribs. It was a voice, a child's voice. She spun around, her eyes searching the street. Her heart raced, hope and fear colliding in her chest. It had sounded like him. It had sounded like Michael. Her pulse hammered as she scanned the crowd. Was it her mind playing tricks on her? Was she losing herself in grief? But then she saw something. A small figure, a boy, standing near the edge of the sidewalk, looking around as if searching for something or someone. Sarah's breath hitched. Her feet moved before she could think. She pushed past people, her eyes locked on the boy. Her hands trembled. Could it be? Could this be the moment she had prayed for every night? Her heart pounded louder with every step she took toward him. But just as she reached out, he turned, and in that moment, the world around her disappeared. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the boy turned. For a moment, her mind refused to process what she was seeing. The streetlights flickered above, casting shadows over his face, but she could still make out the details: the dark hair, the familiar shape of his eyes. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The boy blinked at her, confused. For a split second, hope surged through her chest like a wave. But then, as the light shifted, the illusion shattered. It wasn't him. The boy's eyes, though similar, were not the same. His face held no recognition. He wasn't Michael. Sarah staggered back, pressing a hand to her mouth, as the truth hit her like a punch to the stomach. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she forced herself to stay still, to breathe. The boy glanced at her, hesitating. before his mother, his real mother, called his name, and he ran into her arms. A sharp pain twisted in Sarah's chest. That should have been her. She should have been the one waiting with open arms, scooping Michael up, feeling his small hands clutch at her like he always used to. But instead, she was alone, standing in the middle of a busy street, surrounded by strangers who had no idea her world had just cracked open all over again. She turned away, her vision blurred with tears. Sarah kept walking, her body moving on. Instinct, while her mind spiraled back into memories. She remembered the night Michael disappeared. It had been raining. She had put him to bed, kissed his forehead, whispered, "I love you," just like every night. But when she woke up the next morning, his bed was empty. At first, she thought he had wandered into the living room, maybe curled up on the couch. But he wasn't there. Panic had seized her chest as she searched the apartment, her voice growing louder with every unanswered call of his name. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut. There was no sign of forced entry. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The police had come. They had searched. They had questioned. But days turned into weeks, then months. No leads. No answers. Just an unbearable silence that stretched endlessly, swallowing every last bit of hope she had. She had been through it all, the news reports, the posters with his smiling face, the whispered condolences from people who still had their children safe in their arms. Some had tried to comfort her, but others had been cruel in their assumptions. He must have run away. Are you sure? You didn't miss something. Kids don't just disappear. Maybe the worst part was that, deep down, she had begun to question herself too. Had she done something wrong? Had she failed as a mother? Now, as she walked through the darkening streets, that same unbearable weight settled on her shoulders. She had tried everything. She had begged for answers, for a miracle, but nothing had come. Maybe, after all this time, she needed to let go, but then, a voice. A different one this time. Low, urgent, whispering. She barely noticed it at first, drowned in the noise of the city. But as she passed a narrow alleyway, something made her stop. A hushed conversation. A name. Michael. Her blood ran cold. It could have been a coincidence. Michael was a common name, but something about the way it was spoken sent a chill down her spine. She took a step closer, her hands shaking. In the shadows, two men stood, speaking in hushed voices. One of them held a phone, the screen casting a dim glow on his face. "We should have moved him already," the man with the phone muttered. The boss said to wait. The other replied, his voice sharp. "We can't risk it. Not after last time." Sarah's breath hitched. Every part of her body screamed at her to turn away, to walk in the other direction. But she couldn't. The way they spoke, it wasn't normal. It wasn't right. She pressed herself against the wall, heart pounding. "Kid's been quiet. Probably scared out of his mind," one of them said with a low chuckle. "Not like he's got anywhere to go." Sarah's knees nearly gave out. A surge of panic and fury flooded her veins. Was this real? Could she actually be hearing this? She had to do something. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the police. But just as she lifted it to her ear, a loose stone shifted under her foot, making a small scraping sound against the pavement. The conversation stopped. Silence filled the alley. Sarah froze. Then, a sharp rustling of movement. "Who's there?" One of the men barked. She didn't wait to find out. With her heart hammering, she turned and ran. Sarah ran, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The streetlights blurred past her, the sound of hurried footsteps echoing behind her. They were following her. She could feel it. Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to keep moving. She clutched her phone tightly, her finger fumbling to dial the police. What's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, steady, nothing like the chaos Sarah felt inside. She ducked into a side street, pressing herself against the cold brick wall of a building. I think I just heard something about my son, my missing son, she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. The footsteps had slowed, but they were still there, still searching. 2 men, an alley near Maple and 6th. They said something about moving him. Stay on the line. Officers are on their way, the operator assured her. Sarah wanted to believe. She was safe now. That help was coming. But fear still clawed at her chest. She had spent months living in the unknown, drowning in her own helplessness. But now she had something. A thread, a possibility. And she wasn't going to let it slip away. Summoning every ounce of courage, she peeked around the corner. The 2 men were scanning the street, their expressions tense. One of them muttered something before pulling out his phone, typing quickly. Sarah had a choice. She could wait for the police, or she could do something now. Her heart pounded as she made her decision. She stepped out. "Who are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice louder than she expected. "Where is he?" The men snapped their heads toward her, startled. For a moment, they just stared. Then, one of them, taller, older, took a step forward, his face hardening. "Lady, you need to walk away," he warned. Sarah shook her head. "No, I heard you. You said something about a kid. My son has been missing for months. Tell me where he is." The second man shifted uncomfortably. He looked younger, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure how far he wanted to go with this. But the older one? He wasn't going to talk. Sarah's pulse raced. She had to keep them here. Keep them talking. "My son's name is Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, if you know something, just tell me." The younger man flinched, barely noticeable, but Sarah saw it. He knew something. The sound of sirens in the distance made all 3 of them turn. The older man cursed under his breath. "We're leaving," he snapped at his companion. Sarah lunged forward, desperation taking over. "Wait!" The younger man hesitated, just for a second. Then he did something Sarah hadn't expected. He dropped his phone. The older man grabbed his arm, yanking him away as the sirens grew louder. Within seconds, they disappeared into the night, their figures swallowed by the maze of back streets. Sarah scrambled for the phone, her hands shaking. As she picked it up, the screen was cracked, but still on. A message was open. "Move the kid tomorrow night. New location." Her stomach dropped. This was real. The police arrived moments later. Sarah barely had the words to explain what had just happened, but she forced them out, showing them the phone, telling them everything. Within hours, officers were swarming the area, tracing the phone's messages, chasing the lead. Sarah sat in the back of a police car, her hands clenched into fists. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. The hours dragged on. Then, just as dawn broke, an officer approached her. His face was serious, but there was something else in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in a long time. "We found him." Sarah's world stopped. She barely heard the rest. Something about a hidden location, an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. Details that didn't matter in that moment. All she cared about was that they had found him, and then there he was. Standing in the doorway of the police station, wrapped in a blanket, small and fragile, but alive. His eyes lifted, locking onto hers. "Mom!" The sob that tore from Sarah's chest was the sound of months of agony breaking all at once. She ran to him, scooping him into her arms, holding him so tightly she never wanted to let go. his small arms wrapped around her, clinging to her just as desperately. "You're safe now," she whispered against his hair, tears streaming down her face. "You're safe. I've got you." Michael buried his face in her shoulder, his body shaking. "I missed you," he choked out. Sarah closed her eyes, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I missed you too, baby. Every second." The officers around them spoke in hushed voices, discussing investigations, arrests, next steps. But none of it mattered right now. All that mattered was that Sarah had her son back. The nightmare was over. She had never stopped believing, never stopped searching. And now, as she held Michael in her arms, she knew she never would.